Hey guys, welcome back to the first part of a two-part lecture series over the skeletal system. This is lecture number 1. Here are your learning objectives. I recommend having the lecture handout either out and available or printing it out and having it available so you can take notes by hand. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. So the plan for the day is we're going to talk about histology. We're going to classify bones. We're going to talk about the anatomy of long bones. We're going to talk about the histology of compact bone and spongy bone. Then the lab section is going to be over the axial skeleton, bones and bone markings, and the appendicular skeleton, bones and bone markings. And that's going to be the lab portion of what we would have done today. Now, if you're still in the COVID-19 class, that's associated with lab number 8 over the skeletal system, in which you have that assignment, and it'll start to make more sense. Now, learning objective 1, organs of the skeletal system. We have cartilage. Cartilage aids in support and movement, functions to cushion, really important. We have bones. You don't think of bones as being organs, but remember, an organ is 2 or more tissues working together to carry out a common set of functions. Bones provide a structural framework for the body. They function as points of muscle attachment, and in doing that, they essentially create a system of levers that allow you to move. So when you think about how you actually generate movement, muscles pull on bones, and they pull bones around fixed points called joints, and that's how movement actually occurs, is by muscles pulling on bones. That's why you go and see musculoskeletal specialists. Bone also plays a really important role in mineral homeostasis, notably of calcium and phosphate. Finally, we have joints. Joints are fixed points of interaction between bones that facilitate movement. Joints are also called articulations. So I may use the term joint, or I may use the term articulation to describe some of the joints you need to know. Within your lab, one of the joints you need to know is the knee joint. So that's just something to pay attention to. That's the only joint you need to know in detail for this introductory class. Now, when you think about the skeletal system, we have our bones, which provide the structural framework for the body, facilitate movement, play a critical role in mineral homeostasis. And we have cartilage, and we find cartilage peppered throughout the entirety of the skeletal system. Now, the cartilage you find at the end of long bones is called the articular cartilage because it plays a role in forming the joint. All of the cartilage at the end of long bones, or articular cartilage, is hyaline cartilage connective tissue because hyaline cartilage connective tissue is nice and smooth, and it provides friction-free surfaces for bones to move around one another during movement. Now, the costal cartilages, which make up the anterior portion of the rib cage, form another type of joint that I'm not going to talk about yet, right? Called the synchondrosis, or a joint that's connected with cartilage. And the anterior portion of your rib cage is actually made up of these cartilaginous spears or joints. And these costal cartilages are also made out of hyaline cartilage connective tissue. Now, hyaline cartilage connective tissue isn't the only type of cartilage in the skeletal system. As we've talked about previously, the intervertebral discs, these discs or pads between each of the individual vertebrae, which are really good at withstanding compressive forces, are made up of fibrocartilage connective tissue. The pads in the knee, referred to as the meniscus, are really good at withstanding compression. Those are also made up of fibrocartilage connective tissue. Don't mistake the pads in the knee for the articular cartilage. They're different. So you find 2 types of cartilage in those joints. And the anterior, the pubic bones are latched together by another piece of fibrocartilage connective tissue referred to as the pubic symphysis. Now, externally, we kind of consider this, or we will in this class, to be part of the skeletal system. The ear is made up of another type of cartilage connective tissue called elastic cartilage connective tissue, and we discussed that in the previous section. That's what gives the ear a lot of its elastic properties, meaning its ability to bend and then kind of pop back to its original shape. Now, when we think about the cartilage in the skeletal system, cartilage is kind of like bone in the fact that cartilage is surrounded by a layer of dense irregular connective tissue called the perichondrium. So cartilage has this dense connective tissue structure surrounding it called the perichondrium. Peri means around, chond means cartilage, so it's the structure around the cartilage. And the perichondrium is really important because within the perichondrium you have a type of cell that we're going to talk about extensively in the next video called a chondroblast. So all of these cells in here, when they're completely surrounded by cartilage, are called chondrocytes. Those are mature cartilage cells. But within the perichondrium, you get a type of cell called a chondroblast. And what chondroblasts are capable of doing, unlike their more mature counterparts that they eventually become, is chondroblasts are capable of making new cartilage. So they don't maintain pre-existing cartilage, they make new cartilage. Because of that, the perichondrium is extraordinarily important for things like healing cartilage injuries and cartilage growth. So, perichondrium. Now, we have the different types of cartilage. You should know where you find hyaline cartilage connective tissue versus elastic cartilage connective tissue versus fibrocartilage connective tissue in the body, specifically within the skeletal system, thinking about what we just talked about in our previous discussion. Now, when we think about the functions of bones, bones provide an array of functions. They provide a structural framework for the body that supports the body, right? It's connective tissue off which everything latches, things like your muscles and your organs, etc. So it provides a structural framework for the body, and it protects the internal organs. So your rib cage protects things like the heart and lungs, your cranial cavity protects things like your brain. So support, protection, movement. When we move, it's just muscles pulling on bones around fixed points called joints. Mineral homeostasis, really important. Things like calcium regulation, phosphate regulation involve hormones and chemical factors interacting with bone. Blood cell production. Red bone marrow creates all of your blood cells. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are created in your red bone marrow. Because of that, the red bone marrow is a key contributor to things like the cardiovascular and the immune system. So those are going to be the focal points, and we're going to talk about that more and more as we begin to talk about bones themselves. Now, when you think about bone tissue, bone connective tissue, whether it be spongy bone or compact bone connective tissue, bone tissue, like all connective tissues, is composed of cells. Osteocytes are bone cells, and they exist within a little shallow depression called a lacuna. And then they're surrounded, most of the tissue itself is made up of extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix of bone consists of two components. We have organic components and inorganic components. Now, the organic components are things like cells, fibers, and ground substance. We're going to draw our focal point to collagen fibers. So we're going to talk about collagen fibers with respect to the characteristics or properties of bone. Inorganic components include mineral salts, specifically calcium salts. The calcium phosphate salt that is one of the most important mineral components of bone is called hydroxyapatite. So we have collagen fibers and we have calcium salts. Now, when we think about bone, calcium salts make bone hard. They give it compression strength. So when you think about bones, you think about them as being relatively hard, right? What makes bone hard are those calcium salts. Calcium salts give bone hardness or compression strength. Collagen fibers, on the other hand, give bone flexibility. And because the extracellular matrix of bone has both calcium salts and collagen fibers, bone is both hard and flexible. If bone didn't have collagen and it was completely inflexible, it would be really brittle and it would break all the time. If bone didn't have calcium salts and it just had collagen, it would be overly flexible and it would bow out, or it would, you'd be like Gumby walking around. So when you think about the chemical composition of bone in both compact bone connective tissue and spongy bone connective tissue, you have organic and inorganic components. The organic components are cells, fibers, ground substance, but I really want you paying attention to collagen, right? Collagen is a protein that functions, that provides tensile strength and gives the bone a little bit of flexibility. Calcium salts are the inorganic components that make bone hard. Now, when you think about this from a nutritional perspective, this is where we start delving into a little bit of nutrition and how nutrition can contribute to the overall health of a system. So there are two primary nutritional deficits that have an impact on bone. There are a ton, but we're going to talk about two that are particularly important, especially from a historical context. Now, rickets is a disease in which you're not getting enough calcium, and calcium can't deposit itself in the bone, so your bone becomes overly flexible. It's not good. And rickets stems from vitamin D deficiencies. So throughout the world, right, especially in regions of the where you don't get as much sunlight, or especially in a historical context, even within the United States, rickets was a really common disease to develop before we recognized the link between exposure to sun, vitamin D, and the development of this bone disorder. So essentially, let's say you're not being exposed to enough sunlight, right, because you're working in a factory all day or whatever it is, or you live in Siberia. Well, you need sunlight in order to synthesize vitamin D. Vitamin D is necessary to absorb calcium along the GI tract. If you're not getting enough vitamin D, you can't absorb calcium along the GI tract. If you can't absorb calcium along the GI tract, you can't deposit calcium salts in bone. If bone starts not being able to deposit calcium salts, meaning put those calcium salts into bone to make it hard, you're still cranking out collagen, but you can't deposit those calcium salts. The bone will become flexible. And the telltale characteristic of rickets is kind of the bowing of the legs because the body weight is causing that bone to physically flex. Collagen fibers, on the other hand, give bone flexibility. Now, in order to synthesize collagen, you need vitamin C. Vitamin C serves a variety of roles in a bunch of different enzymatic and metabolic pathways. One of those pathways is vitamin C is necessary for the synthesis of collagen. If you're not getting enough vitamin C, you can't synthesize collagen, which is going to affect all of your connective tissues, notably bone in this case. If you're not depositing collagen in bone, bone becomes overly brittle and it makes it more susceptible to breaking. A disease in which you're not getting enough vitamin C is called scurvy. So think about that when you're thinking about the questions that are asked right now. Now, bone can be characterized or classified based on its shape. So you have 206 bones in the body. You have 80 bones in the axial skeleton, everything that originates along the midline, and then you have 126 bones in the appendicular skeleton. That's lab time. All of those 206 bones can then be classified based on shape. So bones that are longer than they are wide are referred to as long bones. Things like the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the femur, the tibia, the fibula, right? All of those are long bones. Bones that are kind of flat, like the sternum and the bones that make up your cranium, are characterized or classified based on shape as flat bones. Bones that have roughly the same length and width are classified as short bones. I want you to pay attention here. Your carpals, which are the bones that make up your wrist, and your tarsals, which are the bones that make up your ankle, are classified as short bones. And then you have irregular bones like the coxal bones and the vertebrae that don't fit neatly into any of the other categories because they just kind of have a weird shape. So if you get to a question that says which of the following would correctly characterize this bone based on shape, this is what we're talking about, and I've given you a practice question within your handout. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time getting to know or understand the anatomy of long bone. Now, these are some of the key structures you need to know in long bone, but we're going to go to the image that you guys are going to have to label of the long bone, and we're going to go through it, and we're going to talk about the way that this is going to be presented on something like an exam, because understanding the anatomy of long bone is pretty important to understanding kind of the overarching structure of the skeletal system. So when you look at the anatomy of a long bone, right, the end of a long bone is called the epiphysis. So this is the proximal epiphysis because it's closer to the point of attachment. I'm not going to worry too much about proximal and distal designations. The end of a long bone is called the epiphysis. The neck of a long bone essentially is called the metaphysis. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the metaphysis. I'm going to focus more on the epiphysis, both the proximal and distal epiphysis in our discussion. The shaft of a long bone is called the diaphysis. On an exam, if I put a bracket here and I put a bracket here, and I said, Identify the regions of the long bone indicated by A and B. It would be the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Now let's talk about the structures of the epiphysis first before talking about the structures within the diaphysis. In the epiphysis, lining the end of the long bones is the articular cartilage. The articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage connective tissue. Hyaline cartilage connective tissue is nice and smooth, so it reduces friction at joints. The type of bone you find making up the epiphysis of long bones is spongy bone. So you can see the distinction between compact bone and spongy bone macroscopically. It's really easy to distinguish between those two. Now, within the little nooks and crannies of this spongy bone, you have red bone marrow. So that's the substance. So if I said the type of bone in the epiphysis, it'd be spongy bone. If I said the substance you find, right, in that spongy bone, it would be red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is very, very important. It consists of stem cells, and these stem cells ultimately divide to produce red blood cells, aka erythrocytes, white blood cells, aka leukocytes, and platelets, aka thrombocytes. So this red bone marrow, all over your body, wherever there's spongy bone, you're going to find red bone marrow, and that red bone marrow is going to be cranking out red blood cells. Red blood cells are responsible for carrying oxygen around your body, so in that respect, you need your spongy bone in order to meet the metabolic needs of the cardiovascular system. In other words, you need it to transport oxygen around your body. You have white blood cells, which target infection. So red bone marrow is considered a primary immune organ. And you have platelets, which facilitate blood clotting. So you need those to prevent blood loss if you have something like a cut, which is really, really important. Red bone marrow, very, very important. Now, the epiphyseal line, if you ever see an epiphyseal line, that's the fused growth plate. So as bone is growing, the growth plate is made of cartilage. When that cartilage fuses to form bone, you see the epiphyseal line. If you see an epiphyseal line in a bone, you know for a fact that that individual or that bone has stopped growing, which tells you something about the age of the individual from where that bone came, or where the bone was actually derived from. So if you're like a forensic investigator and you see an epiphyseal line, you go, well, this person had to have been done growing, right? Because the growth is fused. So you have the epiphyseal line. Now, when we look at the diaphysis, I want to highlight that surrounding the diaphysis, you have a structure similar to the structure that surrounds cartilage called the periosteum. The periosteum is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue that has a type of cell in it called an osteogenic cell. Osteogenic cells, when they're triggered, turn into osteoblasts, and osteoblasts ultimately make new bone. So the periosteum is really important not just for bone growth, but for bone healing after things like fractures. Periosteum, really important. Contains osteogenic cells, which become osteoblasts. Osteoblasts eventually become osteocytes when they're completely surrounded by bone. So you have the periosteum, right? And then feeding into every long bone, you actually have what's called a nutrient artery. And that nutrient artery projects through a little hole in the bone called the nutrient foramen. So bones aren't just vascular, meaning they don't have just a few blood vessels. They are very, very vascular. They have extensive blood vessel networks in them. This may become important as a clinician because if you break a bone, like a long bone, such as the humerus, and you break it at the point of the nutrient foramen and you sever that nutrient artery, that bone is just not going to heal very well. And that's something that happens frequently in like orthopedic medicine. So then you have the shaft of the long bone, which is made up of compact bone connective tissue, can withstand a lot of compressive forces, also has a lot of torsion strength, right, because of those calcium salts and those collagen fibers. Then lining the inside of this cavity right here is called the medullary cavity. And lining the inside of the cavity, you get a little layer of spongy bone called the endosteum. Now within the medullary cavity itself, you have what's called yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is adipose tissue. It's fat, right? So it's kind of nice to have adipose tissue or fat or these energy reserves, not only to provide a little bit of structural integrity to the bone, but also to provide an energy reserve for these metabolically expensive processes that are happening very close. So Now, when we think about the histological features of compact bone we need to know, here's a list. We're going to go through that on this image right here. This is one of my favorite images of bone that you could ever find. So if you were to take a long bone and you were to cut it in a transverse section and you were to look at it, you'd have the endosteum, which is made of spongy bone connective tissue. So we're going from deep to superficial here. So we have the medullary cavity. In vivo, this cavity would be filled with yellow bone marrow. Then we have the endosteum, which is a little layer of spongy bone that lines that medullary cavity. Now, even though spongy bone and compact bone are made of the same stuff, meaning the ingredients are the same, right? You have calcium salts, which, right, make bone hard. You have collagen fibers, which make bone flexible. The way that the bone is formed is a little bit different in spongy bone as opposed to compact bone connective tissue. So if I was to ask you to identify the specific tissue indicated by the pointer, all this stuff over here is spongy bone connective tissue. Spongy bone connective tissue, unlike compact bone connective tissue, has what are called these finger-like projections. So it has these finger-like projections called trabeculae. And these finger-like projections kind of meet up and they form this porous network. And within this porous network, within these nooks and crannies, you find red bone marrow, right? So the telltale anatomical feature of spongy bone is the presence of trabeculae, these finger-like projections. If I asked you the type of bone indicated by the pointer over here, this would be compact bone connective tissue. So we have this periosteum on the outside. You don't have to know the different layers. Just know that you have osteogenic cells, which when they're triggered can become osteoblasts, and those osteoblasts will start making bone, and we talk about that in the next video. You then have these perforating canals where the blood vessels that are stabilized by the periosteum can kind of project into the bone. Now, perforating canals turn into central canals, and central canals are the centerpiece of the telltale anatomical feature of all compact bone connective tissue, which are repeating units of column-shaped structures called osteons. So these repeating units of column-shaped structures, or these osteons, if I say identify the type of tissue indicated by the pointer and you say compact bone connective tissue, I go good. If I say give me an anatomical justification for your answer, the presence of osteons. Osteons are a telltale feature of compact bone connective tissue. All osteons, which are these structures indicated by the bracket, these repeating columns, surround a central canal. And within the central canal, you have blood vessels, arteries, veins. So not only if bone consists of thousands of these osteons, and each osteon surrounds a central canal, and each central canal has blood vessels, not only is bone vascular, bone is incredibly, crazily, extraordinarily vascular. That's why it heals so well after it's broken. So you have blood vessels, and then the tissue that radiates out looks kind of like a tree trunk or a bullseye. These concentric sheets of tissue that radiate out from the central canal are called concentric lamellae. I'd probably put a bracket around those and say identify the specific structure indicated by the bracket. So this whole thing is an osteon. This is your central canal. These would be your concentric lamellae. And within the concentric lamellae, you find bone cells. So if I said identify the cell type indicated by the pointer, mature bone cells that are completely surrounded by bone are called osteocytes. And these osteocytes maintain the pre-existing bone. They're shaped kind of like daddy long-legged spiders. Now, these osteocytes exist within these shallow depressions, just like cartilage cells do. They like a little space. The shallow depressions in which osteocytes exist, the structures in which osteocytes exist, are called lacunae. Radiating out of these lacunae are these thin little black lines, and these thin little black lines are called canaliculi. Canaliculi allow for diffusion and communication among bone cells, and this is how nutrients get, for example, from the central canal out to the bone cell and how metabolic waste get away. These little black lines are actually little canals that allow two-way exchange. It also allows osteocytes to communicate with one another. So that would be structure, and I'd probably put in parentheses little black line. Now, interstitial lamellae are just remnants of what's called bone remodeling. Bone remodeling is the breakdown and buildup of bone that we talk about in the next video. And the circumferential lamellae just wrap around the entirety of the bone. Those aren't the focal points. What I just talked about are the focal points. So if I was to say identify the specific tissue type, compact bone connective tissue, put a bracket around this and say identify the structure, an osteon. Central canal could also be called a Haversian canal to pay homage to the scientist who discovered it. You can call it either one. I'm going to use central canal. You have these guys, which are your concentric lamellae, concentric lamellae, concentric lamellae. The little black lines, which are the canaliculi. If I'm asking for the canaliculi, I'll say the little black lines. What do? They allow exchange between the cells and their environment. And then the structure here, this is dry ground bone. So when you put bone under a microscope slide, you actually dry it out, you bake it, and you plate it. So the cells are long gone. The cells are dead. So what you're seeing here are the shallow depressions that are left, which are the lacuna or lacunae plurally. Now, when you think about histological features of spongy bone, what I really want you paying attention to is the trabeculae, those finger-like projections. So it's pretty easy to distinguish compact bone connective tissue and spongy bone from one another. So you have the epiphysis here, you have the diaphysis here. We'll ignore the metaphysis for the moment. In the epiphysis, you find spongy bone. Within that spongy bone, you find red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is responsible for making red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Then you have your compact bone, which lines the shaft or the diaphysis. The cavity within the diaphysis is called the medullary cavity. Within the medullary cavity, you find yellow bone marrow, which is adipose tissue or fat. Now, when you look at spongy bone under a microscope, what you see are all these projections, and every one of those little bony projections is called a trabeculae. And those trabeculae form a porous network in which bone marrow exists. So what you're looking at here are the stem cell remnants of the red bone marrow, and that's the stuff that ultimately makes the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. Now, when you think about flat bones like the sternum and the bones in your cranium are kind of like spongy bone sandwiches. So you have compact bone connective tissue, and in the middle you have spongy bone. The spongy bone you find between the compact bone of flat bones is called diplo. Within that spongy bone, right, which is made up of these trabeculae, you have this porous network. And within those pores, those nooks and crannies, you find red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is responsible for producing red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So blood cells are being made as an adult all over your body. Now, cells you need to know, osteogenic cells are stem cells. Remember, stem cells are cells that are capable of becoming anything. You find these osteogenic cells in the periosteum. Osteogenic cells, when they're triggered by either a bone break or stress on the bone from doing things like exercising, ultimately develop into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts make new bone. Another word for making new bone is called bone deposition. So as osteoblasts make new bone, eventually they become entirely surrounded by bone. And when they become entirely surrounded by bone, they change physically and metabolically to form mature bone cells called osteocytes. So an osteogenic cell becomes an osteoblast. It makes new bone. Once it's surrounded by bone, it changes to become an osteocyte. Osteoclasts are not true bone cells. They're actually derived embryologically from white blood cells. They're these gigantic multinucleated cells that break bone down or carry out a process called bone resorption. Now, bone resorption is the breakdown of bone. And bone remodeling really refers to the fact that osteoblasts are constantly making bone or carrying out bone deposition, while osteoclasts are constantly breaking bone down or carrying out bone resorption. So when you think about it, from the bone cell lineage, you have an osteogenic cell. It's triggered for whatever reason, right? It matures into an osteoblast. Osteoblasts start making new bone. Once the osteoblast becomes completely surrounded by bone, it changes physically and metabolically to form an osteocyte. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that maintain the pre-existing bone tissue. Osteoclasts, right, are these gigantic cells, multinucleated. They look like Roomba vacuum cleaners, and they go around and they just break bone down. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about bone remodeling, but it's important to kind of understand the distinction between those. So, when you're thinking about osteoblasts and osteoclasts, here we have some spongy bone connective tissue. You have your osteoblasts, and your osteoblasts are constantly making new bone, and the osteoclasts are constantly breaking bone down. The formation and breakdown of bone is called bone remodeling. Now, one of the questions that's asked to you is about estrogen and testosterone. And I encourage you to look at that kind of independently and figure out how estrogen and testosterone influence this process of bone remodeling to answer that question. Now, the skeletal lab, we're not going to talk about here. We're going to talk about when we do our study session. Thanks very much.